Good morning. If you're in the real estate business or you have been disposing some of your property recently, you might have used one of the different forms of agreements to transfer ownership of a title. The most common is the deed of absolute sale. We also have the conditional deed of sale as well as the contract to sell. Of these forms, which is the most beneficial to the seller and to the buyer? More on this when we return. Welcome back. Let's first cover the most popular form of the agreement, the deed of absolute sale. In the deed of absolute sale, there is a meeting of the minds between the buyer and seller as to the transfer of ownership of the property from the seller to the buyer and the delivery of the property itself to the buyer as well. Hence, even if the seller is receiving payment 30 years after the transfer of ownership, he may no longer take back the property in case of default by the buyer. His remedy against the buyer if there is failure to pay an amortization later on is an action for specific performance on the payments that are still due him. Ownership, again, had already transferred from the seller to the buyer. Contract to sell is different. In the contract to sell, the seller reserves ownership in the property while he delivers the property to the buyer. Ownership never passes. So while the buyer can use the property while he makes payments over, say, a span of 10 to 20 years, he is not the true owner of the land until the full payment, which is predicated by the contract. Therefore, if later on there are missed payments, the seller can simply withhold transfer of ownership to the buyer until the full payments are made. The distinctions between the two forms of contracts is quite clear. As a buyer, you would prefer the deed of absolute sale. Ownership already passes from the seller to the buyer, and even if payments are being made 20 years to 30 years after the consummation of the agreement, you, the buyer, already own the property. This also implies that the seller may not sell the piece of property to a third party pending the full payment that is owed by the buyer. The contract to sell, on the other hand, is beneficial to the seller. In this case, the seller reserves ownership in the property pending the full payment of the buyer, which might take place 10 to 20 years later. In fact, because the ownership is reserved in the seller can choose to sell the piece of property to a third party later on if he feels that the buyer does not have the capacity to continue the full payments as expected and stipulated within the contract. This is Joseph Plazo. Thank you for watching. Again, do not litigate, but rather mediate.